reach heaven's joys, O bright and sun. Heart of my heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler.
Welcome back to our study of the book of Genesis. You remember last time we began to talk about Abraham and about his call, or really, maybe we ought to say calls. He was first called when he was in Ur of the Chaldees. Then, when his father died in Haran, he was called again. And of course, that call begins chapter 12. We know that he went down to the land of Canaan. He went to Shechem, to the terebinth trees that are there. And when he arrived there, you may remember that the Lord promised him that he would give this land to his people. And it's from there that we want to begin our study today. Notice that when God told him that he would receive that blessing, that the next thing that Abraham did was to worship God. Notice, and there he built an altar to the Lord. It wasn't an altar to some false god, to some idol that was worshiped in the area. It was an altar to the Lord. We need to pay close attention to that because it's not the last time that we'll hear it. You see, he moves again in verse 8 of Genesis chapter 12. He moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Later, in chapter 13, which we'll look at in a little bit, we find once more as he comes up out of Egypt. In verse 4, it says, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And then in the 18th verse of that same chapter, one more time, we find, then Abram moved his tent and went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord. You know, you could truly say that Abram's life could be mapped out by the altars that he built. Each stop along the way, almost without exception, you find him either building an altar or returning to an altar so that he can worship the Lord, dedicate himself to the great God of heaven, who was, after all, the one who is blessing them. Someone has observed that an altered life, A-L-T-A-R-E-D, leads to an altered life, A-L-T-E-R-E-D. There's no doubt that that would be true in the life of Abraham. He was a man who was transformed by his worship of God, whose life was altered because of his worship of Almighty God. It's a beautiful thought and certainly can be sustained throughout the lifetime of Abraham, except for two occasions. The first of those is found at the end of Genesis chapter 12. Notice beginning at verse 10, now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it came to pass, when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarai his wife, indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore it will happen, when the Egyptians see you, that they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Now just pause a minute. Ladies, how would it feel to have a man think you are that beautiful? Your own husband say, you are so beautiful that if we go to Egypt and they realize you're my wife, they'll kill me, but they'll keep you alive. They'll want you for a wife, in other words. Well, that's exactly how he felt about Sarai, and this won't be the last time that he will use that type of thinking. But then listen, verse 13, please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you. Well, he's asking her to tell a half-truth. The reality is that they did have, I believe, the same father, but not the same mother. So they were brother and sister in one sense of the word. But the overriding, if you would, relationship here is she was his wife. And that was the thing he was trying to hide by getting her to say this. Well, they went down into Egypt, and sure enough, the Egyptians saw how beautiful she was, and they brought her to Pharaoh into the house of the women. In other words, it looks like she's on tap to, at the very minimum, be a concubine and perhaps even be a wife of Pharaoh. Now, that doesn't work out very well. In verse 16, we find he treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep and oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. You see, Sarai was not available. We know that. Abraham knew that. But nonetheless, because he said, she's my wife, and because she said, this is my she's my sister, and she said, he's my brother, they thought she was eligible. You almost can't say anything against them for it, but God wanted to be sure that Sarai remained purely and truly Abram's wife. And so Pharaoh called in Abram, and he chastised him because of misleading him like that, and he had him led out of the country so that he would not stay there anymore and be a potential threat to anyone around him. Significant in this story, as compared with everything else that we've seen so far about Abram, is the fact that when he went to Egypt, there's not one mention of him building an altar. That seems significant. When he failed to build an altar, and thereby we would assume he failed to really worship God the way he ought to, he began to rely upon himself. He was afraid that the Egyptians would do harm to him, and so he made his own plans and his own provisions. And sadly, it didn't just get Abram in trouble, it got Pharaoh and his family in trouble as well. Plagues were brought upon them because of the actions of Abram. We need to remember that. When we don't worship God as we ought, when we don't put Him first in our lives, we may cease to rely upon Him. And when we cease to rely upon God, the threat is to us and our families that we will be plagued, if not here, certainly in eternity, because of the choices that we have made. But after Abram went down to Egypt and was led out, where did he go and what did he do? Look at chapter 13 and observe. Then Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, to the south. Now, before we go any further, I want us to note something about this passage that will help us in our understanding of all the rest of Scripture. Nowhere in chapter 12 does it say that Lot went down to Egypt. It says Abram went, it says Sarah went, but no record of Lot going to Egypt. But when we get to chapter 13, verse 1, we see that Lot came up out of Egypt with Abram. So what we have here is what's called a necessary inference. From what we learn in verse 1 of chapter 13, we infer that Lot went with Abram down into Egypt because he came up out of Egypt with him. It's important to see that. On occasion in Scripture, there will be necessary inferences. In other words, the only way you can understand it is if you infer something that is not in the text. And that certainly is true here. So they came up out of Egypt, and notice what happens. Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar, which he had made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. When you think about what's going on all around him, particularly what went on in Egypt and what's going on in the land of Canaan, you come to realize that everybody else is calling on the names of false gods. This is the first time in the text where we see a reference to calling on the name of the Lord in regard to Abram. And it's significant. He did not call on the name of the false gods, but instead he called on the name of the Lord. Now, you remember what happened next. Abram and Lot had too much to live in one place together. And it really wasn't a problem between Abram and Lot. It was a problem between Abram's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen. When you think about it, herdsmen make their living based on how the herds do. And the herds will, health and growth will be in large measure dependent upon the amount of feeding that they have access to. How much grass is in the area? How much straw? How much of other things they may eat? How much is available? Well, with two giant herds there, Abram's and Lot's, there was naturally going to be a fight, as it were, over who would get to use what was there, who would get to access that. And that's exactly what happens. The herdsmen begin to be, as it were, at war with each other. Not literally, but very close to that. Abram has a solution. It begins in verse 8 of Genesis chapter 13. So Abram said to Lot, "Please, let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left." And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go toward Zoar. Several things could be noticed from this text. First of all, I love this, Michael Whitworth observed it in his little book, Epic of God. He said, Abram valued relationships over real estate. And that really stands out, doesn't it? He says, you pick. It doesn't matter to me. We're brethren. We don't need to be at war with each other. We don't need our households, our servants to be at war with each other. You pick. Whichever way you go, I'll go the opposite. We've got to take the load off the land. He gives us a tremendous insight into the people we ought to be. The most important thing in our lives, especially as Christians, ought to be our fellow Christians. You think about the like-mindedness that Paul talks about in Philippians chapter 2. That ought to be a part of our everyday lives. It certainly was a part of Abram's life. But then a second observation out of all of this, and it comes from looking at what Lot does. Lot looked out and he saw the well-watered plain of the Jordan. He pitched his tent toward Sodom. How did he make his choice? I'd say he made his choice because of what I'd call the good life. And that's a mistake. The reality is that we should not make our choices based upon the good life, but instead upon the God life. There's nothing wrong with getting a good raise and being asked to move somewhere. Everybody likes to get a little higher pay. Everyone likes to be recognized for their good work. Advancement is not a problem unless it's going to jeopardize the souls of me or of my family. If it's going to jeopardize our souls, then the choice ought to be obvious. Don't choose the good life. Don't choose the easy life. Choose the God life, even if it means not having quite as much. But Lot pitched his tent toward Sodom, and the consequences were rather dramatic. He gets to Sodom, and Sodom at this particular era was one of those city-states. That is, you'll have a king that's over every city. Now, you'll have to imagine where you are at this present time, but single out the big cities that are around you and think, if each one of them was a kingdom, oh, certainly. Some of those cities would be more powerful kingdoms. They have more people. They have more resources. But still, every city is a kingdom with a king who rules over it. That's exactly the way it was in Sodom. There were on that plain 5 kings in 5 different cities who had on occasion, sometime in the past, been defeated by 4 kings from 4 other cities. They'd been paying tribute, we'd say taxes or something along that order. They had to pay money to get those kings to leave them alone now that they'd been defeated. After a time, the 5 kings got tired of paying the 4 kings. And so they decided to cut off the tax money. Well, that worked for a short time. But after that short time was over, the 4 kings rose up and they invaded the land and they conquered the cities of the 5 kings. They took all the people and they took all the goods and they headed off toward home. This then would, as it were, be their taxes. Thankfully, a servant escaped from all the melee that was going on there. And he went and told Abram what had taken place. Notice he came to Abram in verse 13 of chapter 14 of the book of Genesis. Now when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his own house and went in pursuit as far as Dan. You talk about a man who has a great reliance upon God. This is that man. He takes up 318 trained servants from his own household, plus a couple of allies from nearby, and off they go to fight a battle with the armies of 4 kings who have just defeated 5 city-states. How could you do that? Because you know the God you serve is able to overcome no matter who you may face, no matter what enemy may be in front of you. So off Abram went. He divided his forces, verse 15, against them by night, and he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. Boy, that's some more fighting territory that we're talking about now. So he brought back all the goods and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. Now don't get too worked up about that word, brother Lot. The reality is that they use the terminology a little bit more loosely than we do. We just say his kinsman instead of saying his brother. And that would be accurate because Lot is his nephew. He's the son of his brother. And it might be said in certain senses he'd taken the place of his brother because his brother Haran was dead. And that, of course, was Lot's father. But Abram defeated the kings and brought back Lot and his family and all the other families and all the goods and came back to the area where he had been before, where he had lived before, and that is the area of Sodom, where Lot had been living. And notice verse 17. And the king of Sodom went out to meet them in the valley of Sheba, that is, the king's valley, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him. So, here comes Abram. He's bringing back all these goods. The king goes out to greet him, and you can almost hear him saying, greetings, my friend. Thank you for the work that you've done, or something like that. And effectively, that's what we see next, except for one thing. There is another character that appears here. We may not have enough time to talk totally about him today, but we ultimately will because he's such a fascinating and an important character. But notice verse 18. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. Melchizedek. We'll talk more about him in a minute, but notice priest of God Most High. It's another one of those interesting words. In the Hebrew, the word is El Elyon. And you may remember from what we talked about in Genesis chapter 1 that El is a name for God. It actually is plural, but it's the plurality of power, or the plurality of authority. Elyon is translated here, Most High. But when Hugo McCord, in his little book, Getting Acquainted with God, came to this name, and he talked about what it really means, he said a better way to put it would be something like this: God, Commander in Chief. And in our terminology, certainly in the United States, that would be much easier to relate to, much easier to understand. God, the Commander in Chief. I propose to you that a lot of folks are worried about who the Commander in Chief is. And I can say this on either side of the aisle. I'm not being political here. The Democrats are concerned when a Republican is Commander in Chief. The Republicans are concerned when the Democrats have a man who is Commander in Chief. Works that way all the time. And they worry. I mean, they worry to the part of sweating, to the point of crying, because their man's not in office and the other party has someone that's in office who is Commander in Chief. Could I make a suggestion? If you're really a follower of God, it doesn't matter who the Commander in Chief is in the United States. We're going to pray for him. Paul tells us to. Pray for those in authority. 1 Timothy chapter 2. And our Commander in Chief would be one of those. But it doesn't matter who's in that office, for our Commander in Chief is in heaven. The one who can take care of us, the one who can bless us, the one who can provide for us is in heaven. Melchizedek was priest of God, the Commander in Chief. And that reminded Abraham, if he had forgotten, which is doubtful, it reminded him of what the source of his great victory was. It was not his own power or the power of his allies, but instead it was his God, the Commander in Chief. When Melchizedek greeted Abram, he said, verse 19, and he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth." Our God owns it all. You may say, well, I'm a millionaire, and get rather puffed up about it. Well, the reality is there's no reason to get puffed up. Whatever you have, whatever I have, it all came from God, who is both Commander in Chief and the owner of it all. And Melchizedek points that out very clearly. Then he goes on, "And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." Another reminder. Another reason for thanksgiving, and we're going to see that Abraham did that. In fact, it says next, and he gave him tithe of all. Abram had brought back everything, all the people, all the goods. He'd brought them back. He takes 1/10 of everything that he brought back, and he gives that to God in honor of the great victory that God has given him. Now, of course, King of Sodom wants to make it more than that. Let's hear what that says. Genesis 14, verse 21. "Now the king of Sodom said to Abram, 'Give me the persons and take the goods for yourself.' But Abram said to the king of Sodom, 'I have raised my hand to the Lord God Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will take nothing from a thread to a sandal strap, and that I will not take anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich.'" Well, that's a wise thing to take note of. People sometimes want to put you up on a pedestal, but then one of two things is going to happen. Either number one, they're going to try to knock you off, or number two, they're going to take credit for you being there, and they're going to expect you to give to them accordingly. Abram understands that about the nature of man, and he's not interested. After all, it was not the king of Sodom that helped Abram win the victory. The king of Sodom had already lost in the battle. No, it's the God of heaven, the possessor of heaven and earth, who had caused Abram to win the victory. So he'll take nothing from the king of Sodom. Instead, he wants everyone to realize his riches come from God. And you know what? It's the same way with us today. When Paul went up on Mars Hill in Acts chapter 17, he saw all sorts of idols in that city. In fact, some say that Athens in Paul's day had so many idols that they'd passed a law that you couldn't introduce a new god in the city of Athens. And the reason for that was simple: nowhere to put another idol in the whole city without just making mass confusion. So Paul came along. What did he do? He wandered through the city and he found an idol with this inscription: to the unknown God. And then the God they worshiped in ignorance, Paul proclaimed to them, among other things. He said, in him we live and move and have our very being. You know, we may be fond of saying, why, I earned that, whatever that may be. But the reality is that while we did earn it, we did it with the power, the life, the breath that God gave each of us. Abraham understood that. He noted that. And it was very, very important in his life. So, in verse 24, he does tell one thing that he will take. Except only what the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men who went with me, Anar, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their portion. It was not Abram's choice to decide how these other men would act and react. He told those who went with him in battle, you take what you want. This king's offered it to you, take what you want. And they deserved it, for they'd gone out and won it back in battle. But as for Abram, he would give credit to God. Remember Abraham, the man whose life can be traced by the altars, for the most part, that he built. And remember the God, Most High, Commander-in-Chief, who helped him win the victory and blessed him immensely. Next time, we'll take a longer look at Melchizedek.
May I reach heaven's joys, O bride.